You have never truly seen the world as it really is, because before any image, sound, memory, or emotion reaches your conscious mind, the human brain has already quietly filtered it, edited it, and retold it in its own way. Welcome to Sleep by Knowledge. Tonight, we're not just going to talk about an organ resting inside the skull. We're going to step into a living universe that has been silently shaping everything you call reality. It is the human brain that can let an old scent pull you back to years long gone. It is the human brain that can make a small worry cause time to seem as if it is moving more slowly. It is also the human brain that helps you love, remember, dream, heal, and sometimes wonder why you think, feel, and respond in the deeply personal way that you do. On this journey, we will move slowly through the deepest hidden layers of the human brain, from the way it builds your picture of the world, to the way it stores and reshapes memory, and even the way it creates the feeling that you are one continuous, whole, and familiar self. Everything shared tonight is connected, because it all returns to one central truth. The human brain does not simply help you live in this world, it quietly creates the version of the world you're living inside. And perhaps, by the time we reach the end of this story, the most surprising thing will not be how complex the human brain is, but the fact that you have lived your entire life alongside something this miraculous, and so rarely had the chance to pause and truly listen to it. So if you love quiet and gentle journeys like this, lower your screen brightness, relax your eyes, and stay with me until the final truth. Because the deeper you go into the human brain, the more clearly you may begin to understand what is really shaping your memories, your fears, your sleep, and even the person you have always called yourself. So before we go deeper into memory, sleep, emotion, or consciousness, perhaps the gentlest thing we can do is pause for a moment and look directly at the human brain itself, not as a familiar word from a textbook, but as a living universe operating inside each of us. The average human brain weighs only about 3 pounds, which is a little over 1 kilogram, yet that small organ serves as the command center for all of human life. Inside the human brain are about 86 billion neurons, along with many other kinds of cells, and it is from the connections within that enormous mass of cells that brain regions with distinct functions begin to take shape. When we say that we see, remember, feel fear, hope, or drift into dreams, we're really talking about the constant work of an organ that is both small and extraordinary. An organ that not only helps us live, but also gives us an inner life to feel. What is fascinating is that for many decades, people kept repeating a very famous idea that the human brain had 10 times more glial cells than neurons. But more modern counting methods forced science to revise that story. Today, the more reliable picture suggests that the total number of glial cells across the entire human brain does not overwhelm neurons the way the old myth claimed, but is closer to a ratio of roughly 1:1, even though that balance can vary a great deal from one region to another. That also reminds us that the human brain is not made only of cells that send signals, but also of cells that nourish, protect, insulate, clean up, and keep the environment stable so those signals can continue to exist. Glial cells are not anonymous supporting actors. They give the brain its structure, regulate the ion environment around neurons, influence the speed at which signals travel, help shape activity at synapses, and also play a part in recovery after injury. When we look at the human brain this way, it begins to seem much less like a rigid machine and much more like a living ecosystem. Within that ecosystem, each neuron in the human brain carries a shape that almost seems to tell its function in advance. The cell body is like a small center where necessary materials are produced. The dendrites stretch outward like tree branches to receive signals, and the axon, long and slender, is like a road that carries signals across distance. One very basic and very beautiful description from neuroscience says that the axon looks like a long tail sending messages away from the cell, while the dendrites look like tree branches receiving messages back in. It is thanks to that vivid living geometry that the human brain does not merely store information, but also sends it, transforms it, and coordinates it at a speed that our everyday lives almost never notice in time. Every time you hear a familiar voice suddenly catch the smell of rain, or feel your heart soften in response to a piece of music, that is not a reaction coming from one isolated point in your head. It is the result of countless pathways lighting up, fading out, and then handing signals off again in the quiet darkness of the human brain. And yet saying that the human brain is a network still is not enough, because the brain itself is not a uniform mass. The most classic and easy to picture division shows that the human brain can be seen as three major units: the forebrain, the midbrain, and the hindbrain. From there, more familiar structures appear: the cerebrum, the thalamus, the hypothalamus, the cerebellum, the pons, the medulla, and then the brainstem as the bridge connecting the higher parts of the brain with the spinal cord. Just looking at that map is enough to see that the human brain is not doing only one job. Some parts are more involved in relaying sensory information. Some are tied to hunger, thirst, and sleep. Some are closely linked to balance and the coordination of movement. And some handle such basic tasks that we almost never remember to thank them, things like breathing, heartbeat, or the swallowing reflex. The human brain does not create experience with one single voice. It creates it with an entire choir, where each region carries a different part, but all of them contribute to the symphony we call being alive. When we go a little deeper into the surface of the cerebrum, that picture becomes even clearer. The frontal lobe of the human brain is associated with movement, language, attention, working memory, behavioral control, mood, personality, self-awareness, and even social and moral reasoning. The parietal lobe helps interpret sensory information and coordinate movement with memory, hearing, and vision. The temporal lobe plays an important role in hearing, language comprehension, emotion, and the preservation of memory. And the occipital lobe is where the visual cortex helps interpret what we see. If we listen to those descriptions very slowly, we begin to notice something both gentle and profound. The human brain does not receive the world passively at all. The human brain separates, organizes, prioritizes, assigns meaning, compares the present with older memories, and only then hands you an experience that appears smooth and seamless. That means before you can even say that flower looks so soft in color, that voice feels so warm, or this room feels strangely sad, the human brain has already silently completed an enormous amount of work. Even the parts that are often thought of as being concerned only with movement turn out to be far more complex than that. The cerebellum of the human brain has long been famous for helping coordinate voluntary movement and fine-tune accuracy and rhythm, but today we know that it also contributes to attention, language, responses to pleasure, and even fear memory. Meanwhile, the brainstem, which sounds more modest, is actually where some of the most vital centers are kept. Breathing, heart rate, body temperature regulation, the sleep-wake cycle, coughing, sneezing, digestion, vomiting, and swallowing. That means while one part of the human brain may help you remember a conversation from 10 years ago, another part is patiently keeping your chest rising and falling without ever needing permission from consciousness. One part creates memory and can bring tears to your eyes. Another quietly keeps you here so that you're still able to tear up at all. Once we understand that, we begin to see the human brain not only as the source of thought, but as a layered architecture in which the most fragile and the most essential things are always travelling together. Then when we come to the way the human brain actually speaks to itself, we move one layer deeper into the miracle. Signalling in the human brain is not only electrical, and it is not only chemical, it is both at the same time. An action potential travels along the axon. When it reaches the terminal, it triggers the release of neurotransmitters into a tiny gap between two cells, only about 20 to 50 nanometers wide. From that microscopic space, the message continues into the next cell, binds to receptors, and then influences the activity of the receiving cell. This is why the human brain is both fast and delicate. Electricity allows the message to travel instantly. Chemistry gives that message tone, intensity, rhythm, and biological consequences. And so that these signals do not fade away in transit, myelin-forming cells wrap around the axon like insulation, allowing the electrical impulse to leap from one node to the next at much greater speed. Even at its most basic level, the human brain is not simply a system of wiring. It is a continuous exchange among impulses, chemical, structural support, and time. If there is one number that makes people fall silent in awe of the human brain, it may be the energy cost it demands. The human brain makes up only about 2% of body weight, but it consumes about 20% of the body's oxygen, receives about 15% of the heart's blood flow, and uses about 20% of the body's energy supply at rest. What is even more astonishing is that when the human brain moves from a resting state into active task performance, its energy use rises by only a small additional amount. In other words, Most of the brain's cost does not come from those moments when you are trying to solve a math problem or make a major decision. It comes from the background work that is happening continuously beneath the surface of consciousness. The human brain uses glucose as its main source of energy, and in certain special states, when glucose is low, it can also use ketone bodies. But what matters even more than the name of the fuel is the nature of that expenditure. The human brain is so costly because it does not wait for the world to knock before waking up. It is almost always working. That helps us understand why the human feeling of rest does not usually mean silence in the human brain. When you sit quietly by a window, watching shadows of branches sway gently and feeling as though nothing much is happening, the human brain is still maintaining its background connections, keeping vital networks for sensation, memory, language, and self-awareness from breaking apart. That is why modern neuroscience has increasingly moved away from the idea of the brain as an organ that only reacts to immediate stimulation. The human brain has powerful intrinsic activity. It prepares, predicts, sustains states, adjusts relationships, and preserves a continuous sense of the body and the self, even when you are not trying to think about anything specific. We might imagine it softly like this. The human brain is like a city whose power never goes completely out. Some streets glow brightly during the busy hours of work. Some small alleys become quieter when night falls. But even in the quiet, the whole city is still breathing. Another lovely detail in the architecture of the human brain is that almost no region lives in isolation from the rest. The two cerebral hemispheres are connected by the corpus callosum, a large white matter structure that helps coordinate activity between both sides and supports the development of higher cognitive abilities over time. Sensory information from the body passes through the thalamus before being relayed to the cerebrum. Motor and sensory pathways also cross in the brainstem, which is why the right hemisphere controls most sensation and movement on the left side of the body, while the left hemisphere controls most of the right side. That means the human brain does not organize the world like a simple one-way map. It organizes it through loops, bridges, intersections, and relay stations. The more we look into the human brain, the more we see that its power does not come from any one magical region, but from its ability to connect countless specialized parts into one single experience that feels seamless to us. You do not feel the individual pieces. You only feel an afternoon, a face, a longing. But behind that simple feeling is an incredibly refined architecture of cooperation inside the human brain. Even the folded shape of the human cerebral cortex tells a beautiful story. During development, the migration and growth of cells cause the surface of the cortex to fold in on itself, increasing surface area while still fitting inside the skull. The overall architecture of the brain is largely present at birth, but the maturation of the human brain continues for a very long time, generally reaching a fuller level of maturity at around 20 to 25 years of age. White matter increases with age for a period of time, while grey matter gradually decreases according to necessary patterns of development and pruning. Some regions, such as the frontal and temporal lobes, continue to change structurally throughout childhood and into the years of youth. In a very quiet sense, the human brain is not given to us in a finished form, but grows with us, gradually shaped, connected, and refined by genes, by the body, by the environment, and by everything we live through. That is also why the version of the world the human brain creates at age 10 is not the same as the one it creates at age 40, and certainly not the same as the one it creates at age 70. Not because the world itself changes beyond recognition, but because the very instrument weaving our inner reality is also changing with time. The more we step back and look at the whole picture, the more clearly we see that the human brain truly is a living ecosystem. There are neurons carrying information. There are glial cells creating the environment and offering protection. There is the blood-brain barrier, formed in part with the help of astrocyte end feet, helping control what is allowed to pass from the bloodstream into brain tissue. There is white matter like highways carrying signals across long distances, and grey matter like dense processing regions filled with cell bodies, synapses, and tiny blood vessels. There are regions specialized for language, regions specialized for vision, regions specialized for executive control, and regions specialized for sustaining life. But no single region is capable of telling the whole story by itself. And perhaps that is the most honest image from which to begin understanding the human brain. Not a switch, not a chip, not a cabinet for storing thoughts, but a world that is constantly maintaining itself, exchanging with itself, repairing itself, spending energy, connecting itself and changing itself every second. When we live, the human brain is not standing outside and watching. It is participating in every moment, and by doing that, it creates the very feeling that a life is unfolding at all. And from that foundation, a very deep realization begins to emerge. When you think you're simply looking at a room, hearing a voice, feeling a gust of wind, or remembering an old chapter of your life, the truth is that the human brain has already had to recruit structure, energy, electrical signaling, chemical signaling, support cells, relay stations, specialized regions, and interconnected networks in order to create that experience. The human brain does not only help you move your limbs or keep your heart beating steadily. The human brain is working without rest to weave a world with images, sound, meaning, memory, and even you inside it. And the strangest thing of all is this: that ecosystem is not only controlling your body, but also shaping the version of the world you believe you are seeing. Perhaps it is from that very moment when we begin to understand that the human brain does not merely receive the world, but also builds the version of the world we live inside, that an even deeper truth starts to appear. The human brain did not evolve primarily to make us fair, objective, or at peace. Its first priority is to keep us alive. That does not mean the human brain is opposed to truth, but it does mean that in critical moments, it asks a different question before it asks about truth. It asks what is safe, what is dangerous, what needs an immediate response, and what can wait a few more seconds. In the systems described by modern neuroscience, the response to acute threat is part of a real defensive system in the brain, organized to drive behaviors that protect the body from perceived danger. The amygdala plays a major role in processing fear and fear learning, while the prefrontal cortex helps evaluate, restrain, and regulate that response from the top down. Right there in the structure of the human brain, we can already see an ancient negotiation between reacting quickly to survive and thinking slowly to understand more clearly. That is why in everyday life, there are moments when we startle before we even understand why. A loud sound behind us, an object suddenly passing through the corner of our vision, the feeling of missing a step on a stair, and the body has already tightened before any explanation arrives. This is not a sign that the human brain is careless. Quite the opposite. It is evidence that the human brain understands that in some situations being one beat too slow can be far too late. The amygdala has connections with the hypothalamus and many other structures that help organize the body's response to danger, while the prefrontal cortex is where weighing, planning, and impulse control take place. In other words, the human brain has pathways that allow the body to prepare a response even before information has been fully analyzed. Only after that do the more refined evaluation systems step in to decide whether the threat is real, whether the alarm should continue, or whether it is time to settle down. That sequence tells us something deeply human, deeply ancient, and also very gentle. The human brain would rather overreact a little to protect us than react too slowly and lose the chance to keep us safe. Even when we think we are resting, the human brain does not completely give up the job of scanning for danger. Much like a quiet house at night still has silent sensors running in the background, the human brain maintains multiple layers of monitoring over both the outside environment and the body's internal state. Neuroscience makes a fairly clear distinction between exteroception, which is information coming from the outside world, interoception, which is the stream of signals reflecting the body's inner condition, and proprioception, which is the sense of the body's position and movement in space. The human brain combines all three kinds of information to evaluate whether things are fine or whether something deserves more attention. That is why sometimes you can be sitting perfectly still and suddenly notice that your heartbeat feels a little different, the back of your neck has tightened, or the room no longer feels as comfortable as it did a few minutes ago. We often call that intuition, but at a more basic level it may simply be the human brain reading very small signals from the world and from the body itself, then raising some of them to a higher level of priority than usual. When it comes to survival, it is hard to ignore one of the oldest languages the human brain uses to protect us, and that is pain. But what is especially important is that science distinguishes between nociception and the experience of pain. Nociceptors are specialized to detect stimuli that may cause harm or signal possible tissue damage, such as extreme heat, excessive pressure, or inflammatory chemicals. From there, the signal enters the nervous system to warn the human brain that the body may be under threat or about to be. So pain is not just a meaningless, unpleasant sensation. In its acute form, pain is an important homeostatic mechanism that helps human beings avoid further injury, pull a hand away from something hot, stop stepping on a shard of glass, or protect an inflamed area. If the human brain only prioritized truth in a neutral sense, it might wait until all the evidence was in before responding. But the human brain does not do that. It allows warning signals to cut in early, because in the language of survival, an extra warning is sometimes less dangerous than a warning that comes too late. What makes the story of pain in the human brain even more refined is that pain is not as simple as a fire alarm that only sounds when there is actual fire. The brain systems involved in pain overlap with systems related to fear, anxiety, anger, motivation, and even reward. The human brain also has descending modulatory pathways, which means the brain does not only receive pain signals travelling up from the body, but can also increase or decrease the intensity of those signals at different levels of processing. That is why the same level of stimulation can lead to very different pain experiences at two different moments, or in two different people. Chronic pain reveals yet another layer of survival priority. When the warning system is pushed into a state of prolonged activation, the human brain can continue generating protective signals even after tissue has healed or when the danger is no longer as clear as it once was. That's not because the human brain is betraying us, but because a system designed to stand guard so closely can sometimes become too sensitive. A person living with chronic pain often carries not only pain in the body, but also a human brain that has learned to lean more heavily toward threat. Stress tells a very similar story. In the human brain, stress is not merely a vague mental feeling, but a coordinated biological response involving the brain, the endocrine system, and the body. The stress system is organized to mobilize resources when a challenge appears, adjusting cardiovascular function, metabolism, immunity, and behavior, so the body can respond more effectively to adversity. The hippocampus, which is closely tied to memory formation, plays a role in regulating the stress response through negative feedback mechanisms acting on the hypothalamus. The prefrontal cortex helps provide top-down inhibition over the amygdala and related centers, which is one reason human beings are not constantly swept away by alarm. But when stress intensifies or becomes prolonged, that balance can shift. The amygdala may become easier to activate, while functions such as judgment, impulse control and memory that depend on the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex can be affected. At that point, the human brain is no longer prioritizing a full understanding of the whole picture. It is prioritizing the search for whatever might be the nearest threat. That may be why stress leaves such unusual marks on memory. Many studies in neuroscience and endocrinology show that stress hormones from the adrenal glands are closely linked to the strengthening of emotionally arousing memories. This makes sense from a survival perspective. The human brain needs to remember quite clearly the things that once terrified us, hurt us, or forced us into an intense reaction, because those memories may help us avoid danger in the future. That is why a minor accident, a near fall, a late-night phone call bringing terrible news, or even a hospital smell can linger in the human brain for a very long time, sometimes more stubbornly than many peaceful days that drifted by almost weightlessly. This does not mean the human brain loves sadness or favours fear. It simply shows that experiences carrying survival value are often stamped more deeply into our neural record. In the language of evolution, a memory of danger has far greater protective value than the memory of an uneventful afternoon. But this is also where we begin to see the other side of the protective gift the human brain gives us. When vigilance appears at the right time and then withdraws, it is a good gatekeeper. When vigilance stretches on day after day, month after month, it can begin to change the colour of a person's inner world. Neuroscience literature describes chronic stress and prolonged elevations in glucocorticoids as being associated with changes in the hippocampus and prefrontal cortex, regions that are critically important for memory and cognitive control. In lived experience, this may show up not as academic terms, but as very familiar things: more difficulty concentrating, becoming more forgetful, more rigid patterns of thinking, a harder time shutting off negative predictions, and the sense that the human brain always has one finger resting on the alarm button. At that point, the objective world may not have changed very much, but the version of the world built by the human brain already has. The room is the same, yet it feels tighter, An ordinary sentence may sound loaded with hidden meaning. A short silence may be interpreted as a sign of danger. That is when the brain protects us a little too much. And through that very devotion, it can also leave us exhausted. There is a very physical reason the human brain often chooses shortcuts instead of weighing everything slowly and thoroughly. The human brain consumes a very large share of the body's energy compared with its size. Maintaining background activity, transmitting signals, preserving ion balance, and operating connected networks all come at a cost. If every shaking leaf, every vague sound, every fleeting expression on another person's face had to be analysed from scratch by the human brain at maximum depth, the biological cost would be enormous. So in many situations, the human brain relies on past experience, the body's current state, and learned response patterns in order to make decisions more quickly. In other words, many human choices do not begin with a long rational courtroom trial, but with a system already accustomed to asking which option is less dangerous, less costly, and easier to keep stable. This may not be a comforting truth, but it is a very human one. The human brain often is not looking for the perfect answer. It is looking for an answer that is good enough to get us through today. The two-way connection between the body and the human brain also makes survival priority much deeper than it usually feels to us. The human brain does not just observe the body like an outside recorder, it is constantly receiving signals from the heart, lungs, gut, blood vessels, muscles, and internal organs. The vagus nerve, which is the longest cranial nerve, carries both sensory and motor components and travels widely through many organs. The autonomic nervous system, including the parasympathetic branch that is closely associated with rest and digestion, helps regulate heart rate, atrioventricular conduction, digestive activity, and many other background processes. Interoceptive pathways travel from the body up to the brainstem, then through the thalamus and insular cortex, along with related regions such as the anterior cingulate cortex, helping the human brain create an updated map of the body's internal condition. That is why a day when you sleep too little, your heart races, your stomach tightens, and your shoulders tense up is not just a day full of physical symptoms. It is also a day when the human brain itself is receiving a stream of information that pushes it further toward vigilance. The body is not a passive passenger riding on the train of the mind. The body is constantly talking to the human brain, and the human brain is listening very closely. That may be why what we call intuition sometimes sounds like a vague inner voice, and yet feels strangely convincing. It is important to say very slowly and very fairly that intuition is not always correct, and it is not some miracle floating above biology. But in many everyday situations, intuition may reflect the fact that the human brain has already processed certain signs of threat, mismatch, or bodily state before the conscious mind has managed to turn them into words. A glance that is too brief, a tone that sounds slightly sharp, a pause that feels unusual, a room where something seems just a little off, and the human brain may already be leaning toward vigilance, even though we still cannot explain it clearly. Once calm returns, the prefrontal cortex may examine things more carefully, revise the judgment, or even dismiss the initial alarm. But the existence of that alarm is not meaningless at all. It shows that within the human brain there are still older, faster systems, more closely tied to the body, always ready to pull attention towards safety. We might say very gently that intuition, in some cases, is the conscious trace of warning systems that had already been working quietly underneath awareness. Seen this way, we begin to notice a kind of tenderness hidden behind many human difficulties. The human brain can be frustrating at times with its exaggerated startle responses, its stubborn memories, its uninvited forebodings, and those stretches of stress that make us talk faster, think more narrowly, or sleep more lightly. But if we step back a little, we can see that most of these things were not created to make us suffer. They were created to protect us. The brain tells you to pull your hand away from something hot before you have time to write an essay analysing temperature. The brain makes your heart beat faster when it senses danger because it does not know for sure how that danger will end. The brain stamps emotional experiences more deeply because long ago, remembering clearly what almost killed you may have been the very reason you did not make the same mistake again. At its deepest layer, the human brain seems to be doing one single job in countless different forms, guarding the fragility of life. And once we understand that, perhaps we will begin to look back on many moments in life under a different light. The times you react too quickly are not always signs of immaturity. The times you remember one frightening moment too clearly are not always signs of weakness. The times your body and mind tense together in response to something not yet fully formed are not always irrational. Very often, it may simply be the human brain doing the first and oldest job it has ever had. The only complication is that in the modern world, not every alarm signal still matches the true level of danger, and that is exactly what makes the story of the human brain both wondrous and moving. The brain protects us with tools forged in a very distant past, but it has to use those tools to live inside a life that is far more complex. So the more we understand that the human brain prioritizes survival over absolute truth, the more gently we may learn to treat ourselves. Because behind so much worry, pain and vigilance, there often is not a saboteur at all, but an overly devoted night watchman. And from that night watchman, another question opens naturally. If the human brain is always trying to keep us safe, what does it do with memory, emotion, and the images of the world in order to serve that goal? And so the question that opened at the end of our last journey naturally leads us to another doorway. If the human brain is always trying to keep us safe, then it will not wait until it has gathered every last piece of data before giving us a world to live inside. The human brain does something far more practical. It takes in signals that are still scattered, stitches them together, leaves out what is unnecessary, predicts what is missing, and then hands us a picture that feels seamless. That is why we have the feeling that we are seeing the world directly, even though what actually reaches consciousness is usually already a version that the human brain has processed, compressed, labelled and arranged so that it is fast enough, stable enough, and useful enough for the life that is unfolding. But as gently as possible, the human brain does not simply turn your eyes toward the world. The human brain also prepares the frame through which that world can become meaningful to you. This begins with vision itself. We often imagine sight as something like an honest camera. It opens, records, and captures whatever it points toward. But vision in the human brain does not work that way. Our eyes make very fast movements called saccades, happening many times each second, constantly bringing the sharpest part of the retina to different important points in a scene. If the human brain simply recorded everything exactly as it arrived on the retina, we would probably experience the world as jerky, blurred, and always sliding across our field of view. And yet we almost never feel that way. The human brain has to piece those successive snapshots together into a stable scene, while also lowering visual sensitivity around the moment the eyes move so that blur and disruption do not flood into consciousness. In other words, even in the act that seems most basic, simply opening your eyes and looking, the human brain is not copying the world. The human brain has already edited it. Perhaps no example is more gentle and more convincing than the blind spot in the eye. At the place where the optic nerve leaves the retina, there are no photoreceptors, so in physical terms that is a gap that does not receive visual information. If vision were a passive system, we should always see a floating hole somewhere in our field of view. But the human brain almost never lets you notice that absence. Research on perceptual filling in shows that information falling into the blind spot is not left behind as a dead black patch. Instead, the visual system fills it in by analysing the surrounding context, using shapes, lines, surfaces and structures that are most likely to continue through that empty space. A straight line is often seen as continuing straight. A patterned background is often seen as extending onward. The human brain is not being deceptive here in any shallow sense. The human brain is doing what it has always done to help us survive, finding the best possible answer from incomplete information. And the more closely we look at the blind spot, the more clearly we see that the human brain is not simply patching over emptiness to make it look complete. Some models in neuroscience suggest that this filling in process involves higher levels of visual processing, generating a prediction about the most reasonable structure of the scene, then allowing that prediction to shape the region where no signal is arriving from the retina. Put more simply, when sensory input does not fully arrive, the human brain does not stand still and wait. The human brain relies on rules it has learned from countless natural images to guess the missing part in the direction that seems most likely. That is a very important idea, because it tells us that the sense of wholeness we call seeing does not come from the eyes alone. It comes from a negotiation between the data that is present and the knowledge the human brain has already gathered. From here, the role of attention becomes especially clear. We often say we're paying attention to something as if it were just a small psychological choice, but in visual neuroscience, attention is a real process of selection, born from the fact that the human brain does not have the capacity or the energy to process all visual information at the same depth all at once. Attention grants priority to one part of a scene, one feature, one movement, or one goal that matters most to us in that moment. And what is surprising is that attention does not merely decide what gets through the gate of awareness. Some studies also suggest that attention can change the very appearance of what we perceive, for example by increasing the apparent contrast and salience of what is being attended to. That means that in many moments the human brain is not only choosing what to look at, the human brain is also making what it chooses feel stronger in experience. That is also why human beings can miss things that are fully present right in front of them. When attention is pulled deeply into a task, an unexpected object, even one that is physically obvious and visible, may still fail to enter awareness. This is called inattentional blindness, and it is one of the gentlest yet strongest pieces of evidence that seeing does not mean fully taking in everything. The human brain has to filter. The ability to focus helps us work, drive, cross the street, read a book, or listen to someone tell a story. But that same ability to focus also means that whatever falls outside the zone of priority can be missed. So when two people stand in the same room, and one is attending to the light on the table while the other is attending to the expression on someone's face in the far corner, they really are living inside two differently edited versions of the same scene, each one shaped by the human brain. And once we say that, we also touch something deeper still. The human brain does not pass a complete finished film from the visual system to everything else. Descriptions of higher vision suggest that the brain has to create a shorter, more annotated version, something that can be shared with memory, language, planning, and action. That may sound technical, but it is actually very close to everyday life. You do not walk through a garden and keep every single leaf, every grain of dust, and every tiny shift of light preserved exactly in your mind. The human brain keeps what is useful for understanding, remembering, retelling, planning, and responding. It may keep the sense that the path felt quiet, the smell of freshly cut grass, a weathered wooden bench, the broken rhythm of birdsong, and the feeling that time moved more slowly there. What passes through the human brain does not remain as a copy. It becomes a meaningful description. This becomes even clearer when we remember that human experience is never purely visual. The human brain is constantly combining signals from seeing, hearing, touch, balance, body position, and many other sources into a unified perception. Research on multisensory integration shows that this is not some secondary feature, but a foundational property of living perception. Information from many senses is often woven together into a single percept, and both human beings and many other animals tend to combine those signals in a way that is close to statistically optimal, meaning that whichever signal is more reliable in that moment is given more weight. What we experience as one smooth, unified world is actually woven by the human brain from many sensory threads, each with its own level of confidence, then combined in the way most likely to help us orient ourselves in the situation we're in. Because the human brain is always combining, filling in, selecting, and weighting information in this way, illusions are not some side joke of perception. Illusions are an excellent window into how the human brain works. More often, the human brain is applying highly useful rules it has learned from the natural world in order to arrive at the interpretation most likely to be correct. And because those rules serve us so well in ordinary life, the world usually feels stable enough and trustworthy enough. Only when we encounter specially arranged patterns do those shortcuts reveal themselves in the form of illusion, as though the human brain has accidentally exposed one of its trade secrets. And then memory enters the picture, making everything even more refined. We often think memory comes only after perception, as though we first see something and only then store it away. But some lines of research suggest that the hippocampus, the region strongly associated with memory, may also participate in complex perceptual tasks, especially when the human brain has to distinguish between spatial scenes or subtle combinations of features. That suggests that memory and perception do not live apart like two sealed compartments. When you walk into a new street and suddenly feel that it is both familiar and unfamiliar at the same time, or when you sense that something is off in a room before you can even name what feels strange. The human brain may be using older spatial patterns to examine what the eyes are seeing now. Memory studies that measure neural signals with very high time resolution have shown that when human beings expect to see a particular kind of stimulus, the human brain may form anticipatory sensory templates in the visual cortex ahead of time. Put very softly, the human brain prepares a mold in advance. When the real stimulus arrives, if it matches that mold, recognition may become faster or easier. This is a beautiful idea because it helps explain why the very same sound outside in the yard can seem like wind on a peaceful evening, but on an anxious night can immediately feel like a sign that someone is coming closer. What you expect does not merely sit outside the experience and comment on it. What you expect may have entered very early into the process by which the human brain prepares to see, hear, and interpret. By this point, something very familiar in daily life suddenly starts to make much more sense. Why does the road home seem shorter when we are happy? Why can a few minutes feel as long as an endless hallway when we are waiting for an important message? Why can a single moment in fear feel dense and stretched, as though it has been pulled wider? Research on time perception shows that objective time and felt time are not the same thing. Human beings do not have a separate sensory organ for time the way we have eyes for light or ears for sound, and yet the human brain still creates a subjective experience of time passing, and that experience is strongly shaped by emotion, motivation, and attentional state. This means that even something as abstract as the pace of an afternoon does not reach us in any raw, untouched form. The human brain is measuring it, compressing it, stretching it, and assigning meaning to it as part of the world it is building for us. And if we bring all of these pieces together, we begin to understand why two people can look at the same scene and truly see two somewhat different worlds. One person arrives there with a tired body, a private history of memories, a particular expectation, a worry demanding attention, and a nervous system that is prioritizing safety to a certain degree. The other arrives in that same scene with a different heartbeat, different beliefs, different goals and different memories. The light reaching the eyes may be mostly the same, but the brains receiving that light are not the same. And because the human brain is always selecting, combining, filling in and predicting, the final experience of those two people cannot be completely identical. That does not mean reality is entirely subjective. It only means that human experience is always reality after it has passed through the shaping hands of the human brain. There is a very quiet beauty in that discovery. It makes us less naive about our own perception, but it also makes us respect the human brain more. What we call a room, a face, a sunset, a waiting period, a hostile glance, or a moment of peace are not objects that fall untouched into consciousness. They are the finished products of hidden labour. The eyes sweep across a scene, signals are interrupted by motion, gaps are filled in, attention opens and closes its gates. Many senses add their voices, memory offers older templates, expectation prepares patterns in advance, and then subjective time is adjusted by the human brain so that the final experience has shape, rhythm, and meaning. The world we live in, then, is not only what is out there, it is always what is out there after it has passed through the way the human brain reconstructs it. If there is one sentence worth holding on to for a long time tonight, perhaps it is this. The human brain does not only open a window onto the world, the human brain also draws the window frame. The human brain decides which parts of the frame are lit up, which parts soften, which parts are connected, which parts are kept so that tomorrow can still remember them, and which parts are pushed into the distance so that you can go on living without being overwhelmed. Once we understand that, we are no longer surprised that a memory can change the colour of a street, that a period of waiting can stretch across an entire evening, or that an anxious person really does see the world as harsher, narrower, and more restless. Because in all of those moments, the human brain is not merely recording, the human brain is constructing. And from that point, another doorway slowly opens. If the human brain can construct the world that appears before your eyes, then what does it do with the world that has already passed, with the things we call memory? When an old scent suddenly carries you back to a kitchen you have not seen in many years, or when a song makes an entire chapter of your life quietly open up inside you, what is happening in the human brain is not as simple as opening a drawer and pulling out an intact piece of the past that has been carefully stored away. Memory in the human brain does not work like a static archive where everything sits unchanged waiting to be taken down. What modern neuroscience shows is gentler than that, but also far deeper. Memory is a process. Experience passes through us, leaves traces across many different networks, and then each time it is called back, the human brain has to build it again. That means the past you remember is not only what once happened, it is also what the human brain can piece back together from the fragments that remain, from the meaning that was drawn from them, from the emotions that still linger, and from the person you are in the present moment looking back at earlier days. This explains why memory can feel both so familiar and so fragile. In the human brain, long-term memory does not sit as one solid object in a single place, like a roll of film stored in a box. Different parts of an experience may be distributed across many regions related to images, sound, emotion, language, and context, while the hippocampus plays a very important role in linking those parts together when a new memory is first formed. Classic descriptions of memory consolidation suggest that conscious experience initially depends on both the hippocampus and the cortex, and then over time, the hippocampus helps guide a reorganization process so that many memories become more stable within cortical networks. In other words, the human brain does not take a picture and store it in a drawer. The human brain creates a map of connections, and that map stays alive through a network. That is why remembering is more like finding your way through a neural landscape that was once drawn than opening a file that has long been sealed shut. One of the most famous stories that helped human beings understand this began with a medical tragedy. Henry Molaison, who later became one of the most widely studied patients in the history of neuroscience, suffered a severe loss in his ability to form new memories after undergoing surgery that removed both sides of his medial temporal lobe in an effort to treat epilepsy. He could still hold conversations, still keep information in mind for a short time, still retain many older memories, and still preserve many skills that did not depend on conscious recollection. But his ability to form lasting new memories of the events of everyday life was profoundly damaged. From his story, neuroscience was forced to let go of the idea that memory was a single general ability spread everywhere across the brain without distinction. The human brain has different memory systems, and the hippocampus, together with the medial temporal lobe, plays a particularly important role in the formation of many kinds of new declarative memory, especially memory for personal events. We might say very gently that through one painful loss, humanity learned that the human brain does not simply remember. The human brain remembers through different pathways. Once we understand that, we also understand why some things in the human brain disappear very quickly, some stay for a very long time, and some remain even when we do not quite know how to name them. What you hold in mind for a few seconds while remembering a phone number before dialing it is very different from the memory of your wedding day. Memory for how to ride a bicycle, tie your shoes, or play the piano is different again. Current reviews in neuroscience generally treat memory as a set of partly separate systems: working memory for holding and manipulating information briefly, declarative memory for facts and events that can be described in words, and non-declarative memory for skills, habits, priming, and changes in behavior shaped by experience without conscious recollection. This matters a great deal for how we understand the human brain, because it explains a familiar paradox. A person may forget what they ate yesterday, yet their hands still find the right piano keys on their own. A person may not be able to clearly retell a lesson they learned, yet when a similar situation appears, the human brain still responds with greater skill than before. Not every memory lives in the same room. And then we come to the most delicate point of all. Even after a memory has been formed, each time the human brain brings it back, that memory is not completely sealed. A great deal of research on reconsolidation suggests that when a memory is reactivated, it can enter a more changeable state before being stabilized once again. That may sound technical, but its meaning is deeply familiar in everyday life. Every time you tell a family story, every time you think about an old separation, every time you remember someone's face on a rainy evening, the human brain is not merely reading the memory. The human brain may also be updating it with your present emotions, with new knowledge, with details you heard from other people, or with gaps it has to fill in on its own. So remembering is not always a return to the past. Sometimes, for the human brain, remembering is also rewriting the past in the form of a new telling. Because memory in the human brain is a reconstructive process, what is usually preserved is not every absolute detail, but the meaningful shape of an experience. Research on remembering in everyday life shows that most details of daily events are not retained for long, with the sharpness we often imagine. At the same time, studies on gist-based memory suggest that when the human brain grasps the theme, pattern, or overall essence of an experience, that can both help us understand and act more effectively, and also make us more likely to fill in particular details incorrectly. Put in a very human way, the human brain often keeps what a story meant to us more than it keeps every physical grain of dust in the scene. You may forget the exact colour of the chair in the room, but still remember that it was the place where you heard news that changed your life. You may no longer be certain whether that hand rested on the left or the right, but still remember very clearly what it felt like to be held. In many cases, the human brain prioritizes meaning because meaning has greater survival value than perfect accuracy in every tiny piece. That does not mean the human brain is careless with truth. It only means the human brain has to live within limits of energy, time, and processing capacity. If every moment were preserved in full detail forever, memory would probably become more of a burden than a useful ability. So forgetting is not always a failure. Many scientists see forgetting as an adaptive function, helping reduce noise, reduce competition among pieces of information, and allowing the human brain to stay flexible when making predictions or decisions in the present. Even sleep, which is often praised for its role in memory consolidation, is supported by evidence suggesting that it also participates in selective forgetting, preserving what is more important while weakening what is less useful. Seen this way, forgetting in the human brain is not always a loss. Sometimes it is a clearing of the path. It creates the space needed for what remains to become clearer, more meaningful, and easier to use tomorrow. Of course, among all forms of memory, emotional memories often cling with a force of their own. The human brain does not treat every experience equally. When an event comes with fear, pain, intense happiness, deep shame, or unusual emotional impact, the amygdala and other systems related to emotion can influence the encoding and consolidation of that memory. That is why so many people remember very clearly the setting of a late-night phone call, a near accident, a fateful meeting, or a hospital room on the day a loved one passed away. But the important point is that a powerful emotional memory is not the same thing as a perfectly accurate memory in every detail. Research on memory in the courtroom has shown that people can feel extremely confident in an emotional memory, even when that memory still contains distortions, especially in the details surrounding the edges of the event. The human brain keeps the core of what mattered for survival and for the self, but that core may glow brightly while the outlines around it have already changed colour. This is also where sleep enters the story like a quiet craftsman of memory. What sleep neuroscience emphasizes very clearly is that remembering does not end when we stop learning or stop experiencing. During sleep, the human brain keeps working on what passed through the day before. Materials from the United States National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke explain that memory consolidation most likely requires both non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. Models of systems consolidation during sleep also suggest that while we sleep, the hippocampus and the cortex engage in a kind of dialogue through characteristic rhythms, helping stabilize and integrate new memories into networks that already existed before. If daytime is when experience plants seeds, then nighttime is when the human brain quietly decides which seeds will take deeper root. That is why the advice to sleep on it before trying to remember more may sound homespun, but is actually very close to biological truth. What is beautiful here is that this process does not happen only with academic memories. It also touches skills and ordinary learning in daily life. Research from the United States National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke suggests that even short rest periods after learning a new skill can be accompanied by the human brain replaying a compressed version of the memory that has just been formed. And when sleep arrives, that replay may become more systematic, helping memory grow not only stronger, but also more deeply woven into the wider structures of lived experience. So sometimes we think we're doing nothing while we rest, when in fact the human brain is still arranging things. A piano passage practiced in the afternoon may feel steadier the next morning. A concept that still seemed hazy tonight may become clearer after one full night of sleep. The very recent past in the hands of the human brain is never completely still. But this same flexibility also opens the door to a phenomenon that leaves human beings both amazed and slightly unsettled. False memories can feel astonishingly real. A great many studies show that false memory does not have to be an intentional fabrication. It can arise from the very normal mechanisms the human brain uses to build memory, relying on the main idea, filling in gaps, using familiarity as a signal, blending details from several different experiences, or taking in suggestive information from the outside and unintentionally weaving it into an older story. What is especially striking is that even people with extremely strong autobiographical memory are not completely immune to false memory. That shows us that changeability is not some side flaw, but a foundational part of human memory. The human brain has chosen a system flexible enough to update, imagine, generalize, and learn quickly from experience. And the price of that flexibility is that the line between what once happened and what has been retold is sometimes no longer absolute. For adults and older people, this touches yet another emotional layer. Many studies of autobiographical memory show that when people remember their own lives, what returns is not only the event itself, but also the connection between that event and the feeling of who they are. There are memories often called self-defining memories, meaning vivid, emotionally rich memories that are revisited again and again and tied directly to enduring personal concerns. These memories help maintain coherence and continuity in the self, especially during periods of transition or difficulty. In other words, the human brain does not use memory only to tell stories about the past. The human brain uses memory to preserve the feeling that a person is still the same self across time. Some studies also suggest that later in life, when recalling autobiographical events, people may sometimes provide relatively more semantic details or broader meaning than purely sensory fragments. That does not necessarily make memory poorer. Sometimes it shows that the human brain is leaning more toward preserving the meaning of a life. That may be why an older person may not remember the exact date of a long journey, yet still remember clearly that it was the first time they truly saw themselves as brave. They may not preserve the perfect order of every conversation, yet still keep the essence of a relationship, a loss, a season of healing, or a period that changed them. Over the years, the human brain seems not only to gather what happened. The human brain distills a life into stories that can be carried forward, and a story that can be carried does not have to be accurate in every detail the way an archive would be. It only has to be true enough in meaning to continue supporting the person who tells it. This is where memory and identity become deeply intertwined. What you remember about yourself does not merely reflect the person you once were, it also helps create the person you are still becoming. And that is why, when we say that the human brain retells the past every time it remembers, the sentence is not merely poetic. It is actually a fairly precise description of how memory really works. The human brain does not keep the past like a sealed museum. The human brain keeps traces, connections, main ideas, emotional nodes, skills that have entered the body, what is needed for action today, and stories strong enough to support a sense of self. Then every time you remember, the human brain takes those pieces out, rearranges them, patches them, brightens one part, softens another, compares them with the present, and builds a new appearance of the past. That is why memory can comfort, deceive, heal, trouble us, and change along with the person who is doing the remembering. The past inside the human brain does not fully die. It continues living in the form in which it is retold. And once we see that, we move a little closer to an even larger realization. If memory in the human brain always travels with emotion, is always selected by meaning, and is always returned to the self as a living story, then perhaps to understand memory fully, we must also understand how the human brain uses emotion to guide that entire experience. Once we go deep enough into memory, it becomes almost impossible to avoid emotion, because inside the human brain, those two things have never truly travelled on separate paths. Human beings often like to imagine that reason sits in one bright place, while emotion belongs somewhere else, darker, louder, and less trustworthy. But what neuroscience shows is far gentler and far more complex than that. Emotion does not merely interrupt thought. Emotion helps the human brain decide what deserves attention, what deserves to be remembered, what needs to be avoided, what is worth moving toward, and what matters enough to become part of the living story of who we are. In other words, if memory is the way the human brain retells the past, then emotion is what gives each piece of that story its colour, its weight, and its level of priority from the very beginning. For many years, science and philosophy had a habit of describing emotion as something opposed to clear thinking. But when we look at the way neural networks actually work, we see that the human brain does not divide itself so neatly. Major review studies on the interaction between emotion and cognition show that emotion can directly shape selective attention, working memory, cognitive control, and decision-making, while regions of the prefrontal cortex can in turn regulate emotional responses from the top down when the situation calls for it. The amygdala, the prefrontal cortex, the cingulate cortex, the insula, and many other structures do not work like isolated islands. They are connected in loops, where what we call thinking and what we call feeling constantly influence one another. So when we say that the human brain uses emotion as a guide, we are not talking about weakness. We are talking about one of the brain's most basic organizing principles. This becomes especially clear in decision-making. Many of the important choices in a human life are not solved by the human brain with a cold spreadsheet. Research influenced by the somatic marker hypothesis suggests that bodily states linked to emotional experience can shape long-term decisions, especially when a situation is too complex for reason to slowly weigh every possibility one by one. The heaviness in your chest when a choice feels somehow wrong, the sense of lightness when a path suddenly feels more right, or the vague tension that rises before accepting an invitation that sounds perfect on paper, of course, are not always accurate. But they do show that the human brain does not make decisions only through a quiet inner monologue. The human brain also listens to the marks that past experience has left on the body. The orbitofrontal cortex, the ventromedial prefrontal cortex, and the amygdala are structures often mentioned in the connection between emotion, value, and choice. That makes human decision-making feel less like the total victory of analysis over feeling, and more like an ongoing negotiation between the two. That may be why emotion in the human brain works like a system for marking what matters. When something frightens us, delights us, wounds us, comforts us, or fills us with hope, the human brain does not merely register the event itself. The human brain also changes the way it distributes attention, the way it recruits memory, and the way it assigns value to the situation. Neuroscientists describe emotional states such as stress or anxiety as having a deep influence on selective attention, working memory, and cognitive control, and that influence can last longer than the emotional episode itself. In everyday terms, if you are sad, you do not simply have sadness standing outside the world and watching it. You have a brain that is more ready to notice what feels sad, remember what hurts, and interpret ambiguous signals in a heavier way. Emotion, then, is not just the content of experience. It is the filter of experience. Fear is a very clear example of that guiding power. When the human brain senses danger, attention tends to narrow, the body becomes more prepared, and signals related to threat are given greater weight. But at the other end of the spectrum, the reward system does something very similar in the opposite direction. Reviews of reward-related learning show that the human brain uses reward prediction and prediction error signals to learn what is worth pursuing, what is worth repeating, and what should be ignored. Dopamine is not simply the chemical of pleasure in any simple sense. It plays a major role in reward learning, motivation, and the shaping of goal-directed behavior. This helps explain why hope, anticipation, small successes, or the promise of reward can completely change the way the human brain distributes attention. The human brain does not view every possibility with the same brightness. Whatever carries threat or promises value can be pulled into the foreground. Loss does something similar, and sometimes even more strongly than gain. Many lines of research on value-based decision-making show that human beings are often more sensitive to the risk of losing something than to the chance of gaining an equivalent amount, a phenomenon commonly called loss aversion. When the fear of loss enters the picture, the human brain may become more cautious, weigh risk more heavily, and lean more toward protection than expansion. Some studies also suggest that fear can increase loss aversion. This does not make reason disappear, but it does change the balance within reason. Because in the human brain, the value of a choice is not calculated only in abstract numbers. It is also felt through the sensation of insecurity, through memories of previous disappointments, and through the biological energy the body is willing to spend to avoid pain more than to chase pleasure. That is why so many decisions in life become a bargaining process between hope and fear of loss, between moving forward and pulling back. The more we look at it this way, the more clearly we see that the body does not stand outside emotion. Heart rate, breathing rhythm, muscle tension, hunger, fatigue, warmth, or tightness in the chest or stomach, all of these are signals that the human brain continuously reads through interoceptive systems. The science of interoception describes this as the process by which the body is sensed, interpreted, and integrated within the brain, with the insular and related networks playing a prominent role. Many recent studies even treat interoception as a foundation for emotion and for the sense of self. That means when you're breathing fast, your heart is racing, your shoulders are tight, and your stomach is clenched, you are not just experiencing physical symptoms that happen to accompany a mental state already in place. Those bodily signals are actively helping create that mental state. The human brain listens to the body in order to decide how threatening the world feels, how comforting it feels, or how guarded it needs to become. That is why even a small physical change can sometimes alter the entire tone of an evening inside your mind. A night of too little sleep can make the heartbeat harder to settle. A day with too much coffee can make the muscles more tense. A quiet hunger can make the human brain more irritable. A breath that becomes slower and longer can make the world around you seem slightly less sharp-edged. Once we understand that connection, we stop treating emotion as something that belongs only to some vague inner soul. The human brain builds emotion from both bodily data and the outer situation, and because of that, caring for emotion is not only about changing thoughts, it is also about changing the conditions the body is sending back to the human brain. Many practices that seem very simple, such as resting more fully, breathing more evenly, walking, or calming the body's overall level of stimulation, can change the way the human brain reads and rewrites reality in that moment. Another layer of emotion that carries real biological weight is social emotion. Shame, exclusion, contempt, loneliness, being accepted or being truly heard are not things that merely float on the cultural surface and stop there. Many neuroscience studies show that social pain and physical pain overlap significantly in some processing pathways, and reviews from the United States National Institute on Aging also emphasize that loneliness and social isolation are linked with higher risk for depression, cognitive decline, heart disease, and many other health problems, especially in older adults. This fits perfectly with the logic of the human brain. A species that survives through cooperation, raises its young over a long period, and depends heavily on signals from other people will have to treat belonging and exclusion as events of deep survival importance. That is why a cold glance, a rejection, or a long stretch of loneliness can truly change the way the human brain evaluates the world. And because the human brain is so sensitive to the social world, safety is not only the absence of physical danger. Safety is also the feeling of being supported enough that the nervous system does not have to devote all of its resources to defense. Research on fear learning and safety learning shows that the human brain and the nervous system as a whole must learn both signals of threat and signals of safety, and the ability to tell the difference between real danger and situations that do not require alarm is an extremely important adaptive mechanism. When signals of safety are recognized clearly, many networks related to threat can quiet down, making room for broader attention, better learning, and greater cognitive flexibility. In ordinary life, very few people learn well, think broadly, or love deeply when the body and the human brain are in a state of contraction. The human brain opens most fully when it feels that it does not have to remain in constant defense. Safety, in that sense, is not some extra reward that comes at the end. It is the basic condition that allows many of the mind's better qualities to emerge at all. That is why calm is not the same thing as numbness. In the human brain, calm is closer to good regulation than to the absence of emotion. Research on emotion regulation shows that strategies such as cognitive reappraisal are linked to the involvement of prefrontal regions in shaping the responses of the amygdala and other emotional systems. That does not mean a calm person is someone who never feels sadness, fear, anger, or tenderness. More often, a calm person is someone whose brain can receive an emotion, allow it to exist, and then slowly place it inside a wider frame without letting it stain the entire world beyond repair. That is a subtle coordination between feeling and thinking, not a civil war between the two. Many effective forms of psychotherapy and a wide range of disorders do not aim to erase emotion. but to help the human brain regulate the intensity, duration, and behavioral impact of emotion. From this point of view, many of the important choices in a human life begin to appear not as products of pure logic, but as the outcome of an ongoing negotiation. On one side are faster systems, closer to immediate value, threat, reward, habit, bodily markers, and emotional memory. On the other side are slower networks, more inclined toward reflection, long-term goals, comparison among possibilities, and the ability to tolerate delay. The human brain does not turn one side off in order to turn the other on. The human brain lets them talk, compete for priority, influence one another, and sometimes correct one another. That is why there are days when we know what is right, and still choose what feels good in the moment, and also days when we manage to move through a strong impulse in order to protect what matters more to us. That complexity is not a design flaw. It is the way the human brain balances immediate survival with a life shaped by longer purpose. Understanding this also helps us become gentler with ourselves and with other people. A person who is sad does not simply have a bad mood. They have a human brain that is marking fewer things as rewarding, detecting threat more easily, finding concentration harder, and struggling more to make decisions. A person who has just been encouraged is not simply happier. They have a human brain that is widening attention, seeing the future as less closed off, and becoming more willing to invest effort. A person who has been lonely for a long time is not simply feeling alone. They may be living with a nervous system that reads the world as less safe and less supportive. Emotion, then, is not some decorative layer added on top of cognition. Emotion is the way the human brain assigns value, gives weight, and establishes priority across the whole of reality it is constructing. If there is one deep truth worth holding on to after everything we have just walked through, perhaps it is this. When you change emotion, you do not just change mood, you change the way the brain is writing reality. You change what in the room stands out, what in memory lights up first, how a sentence is heard, the pace at which time seems to move, how wide or narrow attention becomes, and even how the body feels from within. The human brain does not use emotion as a layer of colour brushed on at the very end. The human brain uses emotion as a guiding pen, to know what to move toward, what to avoid, what to learn from, whom to attach to, and in what tone to tell the story of the self. And because emotion has that kind of power, the next doorway has almost opened on its own. If the human brain is a social brain, if its emotions are deeply stirred by faces, voices, distance, and belonging, then to understand the human being all the way through, we have to keep going into the place where the human brain meets other people. Once we've gone through emotion, we are almost standing right in front of a truth that is very hard to avoid. The human brain is not simply a brain sitting inside one separate head. The human brain is a social brain. From very early on, the human brain learns to grow inside the gaze of other people, inside the rhythm of other people's voices, inside the presence or absence of other people. Social neuroscience does not treat social behaviour as some decorative cultural layer added at the end. It sees it as a very deep part of human biology. Networks involved in social perception, assigning meaning to other people, inferring intention, and adjusting behaviour according to relationships have been described consistently across many studies, showing that social life does not stand outside cognition, but enters into the very way the human brain processes the world. Put very slowly, human beings do not simply use the brain to live beside one another. The human brain has been shaped through the process of living together. That becomes especially clear in the face. Out of all the countless objects the eyes see each day, the face holds a special place in the human brain. Decades of research have shown that the region called the fusiform face area on the underside of the temporal lobe plays a prominent role in face perception, and the processing of faces is also linked with many other regions involved in interpreting expression, gaze direction, social value, and emotional meaning. The human brain does not look at a face the way it looks at a cup or a chair. Just a very slight furrow of the brow, a gaze that softens for a moment, or a corner of the mouth lifting briefly can immediately change the way the human brain understands a situation. That is because for the human brain, a face is not just a shape. It is a signal of safety, goodwill, status, attention, belonging, and sometimes even danger. Many times, before words are fully understood, the face has already tilted the human brain in a certain direction. The eyes go even further than that. Research on the superior temporal sulcus shows that the human brain is especially sensitive to dynamic social signals, such as gaze direction, biological motion, and intention, beginning to reveal itself through behavior. When someone looks directly at you, looks away, or glances toward an object, the human brain does not merely see two pupils moving. The human brain reads the other person's attention, guesses what they are oriented toward, whether they are inviting or avoiding, warning or sharing a point of view. A very young baby already begins learning about the world by following the gaze of a caregiver. An adult does the same thing, only faster and in a more refined way. In a crowded room, sometimes a single glance turning away is enough for the human brain to understand that it has just been overlooked. And just one warm gaze lingering a little longer than usual can be enough to help the human brain soften. The human voice carries a very similar kind of weight. Research on voice perception shows that the superior temporal gyrus and related regions in the auditory cortex respond strongly to the human voice, and the human brain can very quickly extract from a voice not only content, but also approximate age, sex, emotional state, trustworthiness, and the identity of the speaker. That means when someone begins to speak, the human brain does not hear words alone. The human brain hears a person. A familiar voice in the night can calm the nervous system far more quickly than a comforting sentence written on a screen. A sharp tone, even when the words themselves are polite, can still make the human brain tighten. Even before the full meaning of a sentence is understood, the human brain has often already read its social tone. This helps explain why face-to-face conversations where there is vocal rhythm, pauses, breathing, and the warmth of sound often affect us far more deeply than dry information passed along through text alone. From faces and voices we come to language, and here too there is something worth holding on to for a long time. Language is not the whole of thought, and many studies have shown that not every form of thinking depends on language networks. But at the same time, language is not merely a tube for sending information from one person to another. Language helps the human brain package experience into concepts, hold goals in mind, remind itself of things, retell the past, imagine the future, and build a story about the self. Research on inner speech shows that talking silently to ourselves is closely tied to self-regulation, working memory, planning, and behavioral control. So when the human brain learns language, it does not simply gain a means of communication. It gains a tool for organizing inner life. We do not only speak to other people through language. Very often the human brain uses language to arrange itself, and because it is a social brain, the human brain does not only respond to other people one moment at a time in isolation. The human brain also settles when there is synchrony. Many studies on interpersonal synchrony show that when people cooperate, move together, keep time together, exchange face-to-face, or do something in a shared rhythm, physiological and neural processes can show coordination across time. This has been observed at the level of movement, at the level of autonomic physiology, and more recently even at the level of measuring brain activity between two people during real interactions. To be fair, this field is still developing, and not every form of synchrony means the same thing. But the overall picture is fairly consistent. Social alignment is linked with bonding, cooperation, and sometimes with reduced stress. The human brain seems to breathe more easily when it does not have to navigate the world alone, but is placed into a shared rhythm with someone else. A walk beside another person, a song sung together, a nod that lands in time with your own. Sometimes these things are very small, but still enough for the nervous system to understand that it is not alone. If synchrony can soothe the human brain, loneliness does the opposite in ways that are deeply real. Reviews from the United States National Institute on Aging and many large studies show that loneliness and social isolation are associated with higher risk of depression, cognitive decline, cardiovascular disease, and lower quality of life in older adults. What matters is that loneliness is not exactly the same as being alone. A person can live alone without being lonely, and can also be surrounded by many people while still feeling deeply lonely. For the human brain, loneliness is the subjective experience that the social connection one has is not enough, not safe enough, or not truly reaching the self. Some research in affective neuroscience also suggests that loneliness comes with changes in the processing of social reward, attention to social signals, and levels of vigilance toward threat. Put very gently, when loneliness lasts too long, the human brain does not simply become sadder. A caregiver also helps regulate emotion and stress responses from the outside, almost as if lending the young human brain a more mature nervous system to help it stabilize. Many developmental studies have shown that the presence of a caregiver can reduce amygdala reactivity and serve as a form of social buffering, softening the impact of stress. Over time, part of that regulatory ability is gradually internalized. This means the human brain learns how to calm down, trust, and return to balance not only through genes or inborn temperament, but through thousands of moments of being picked up, being answered, being soothed, and learning that when fear rises, someone comes. The traces of those early years do not determine an entire destiny, but they do help shape what the human brain comes to expect from relationships and from the world. From attachment, the human brain goes even further toward one of the most refined social abilities of all, guessing what is happening inside another person's mind. We do this so easily that we often forget how complex it really is. Just by seeing someone pause before answering, glance toward the window, furrow their brow, or smile only halfway, the human brain has already begun forming guesses about their beliefs, intentions, feelings, and goals. Research in this area calls it theory of mind or mentalizing, and neuroscience reviews over many years often mention the role of regions such as the medial prefrontal cortex, the temporoparietal junction, and the anterior temporal lobe in supporting tasks that involve inferring the mental states of others. This ability does not let us read thoughts like magic, but it does allow the human brain to live in a world where other people are not simply moving objects. They are other minds, and we are constantly trying to imagine what may be happening inside them. It is that quiet effort that creates so much of the subtlety, misunderstanding, love, and conflict in human life. Then from the individual person, the human brain moves into broader social forms such as stories, music, ritual, and shared memory. Research on music and social bonding shows that singing together, dancing together, keeping rhythm together, or taking part in group musical activity can increase feelings of closeness and cooperation, partly through motor synchrony and related physiological responses. Research on storytelling also shows that when people are drawn into a story, the human brain is not merely following information. It recruits networks involved in meaning, emotion, and social imagination, allowing the story to keep echoing in thought afterward. And at the community level, collective memory is formed through communication, through repetition, and through the things a group of people keeps and passes on together. So a hymn, a ceremony, a family story told again and again, or a song from the years of youth is not just culture sitting outside biology. These things pass through the social brain itself, and that is how they bind one person to another. By this point, we may begin to see more clearly something that is both beautiful and difficult. A person does not become themselves only through what happens inside their own skull. A person becomes themselves in relationship with other people. Our autobiographical memory is full of other faces. The language we use to understand ourselves was learned from a community. The way the human brain evaluates safety or threat is deeply shaped by moments of being held or being abandoned. The way we speak to ourselves often carries the echo of voices that helped raise us. Even the feeling of self-worth is often given neural form through being recognized, being heard, being answered, or being dismissed. The self, then, is both personal and intersubjective, meaning that it is created through interaction between minds. The human brain gives us the feeling that we are one separate person, but much of the material it uses to build that person comes from life with others. Perhaps that is the gentlest truth of the social brain. The human brain does not only learn about the world through light, sound, and memory. The human brain learns about the world through other people, through a face that responds, through a voice warm enough to trust, through a community in which we are called by name, through moments of moving in rhythm with someone else in speech, footsteps, music, or silence. And also through the painful absences that come when that presence is missing. So when we speak about the self, we are really speaking about something that is never completely alone. Inside every human brain there are traces of other human brains. And from here, another doorway opens very naturally. If the human brain has grown within relationships, has been regulated, shaped and awakened by other people, then at night, when the social world temporarily falls quiet and the eyes close, what does the human brain do with everything it has learned, felt and carried through the day? And then, when the faces, voices, stories and shared rhythms of the day gradually fall into the background, we often feel as though everything in the human brain is settling down along with them. But that feeling is only half true. At night, the human brain does not shut down like a house with the doors locked. At night, the human brain changes shifts. It steps away from its work of facing the outside world and moves into a quieter kind of labour, more hidden, more private, but no less important. It is in that darkness, when conscious awareness begins to loosen its grip, that the human brain keeps sorting, selecting, strengthening, adjusting, and sometimes clearing away what the day has just carried through it. Sleep, then, is not an empty gap between 2 days. Sleep is part of the very way the human brain creates a meaningful life. The first thing to keep very clear is that the sleep-wake cycle of the human brain is not determined by a single switch. Official sources from the United States National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute, and the United States National Institute of Mental Health both describe sleep as being shaped by two major processes at the same time. One is the circadian rhythm, the inner clock of about 24 hours that helps set the timing of sleepiness and alertness. The other is sleep pressure, the drive that gradually builds the longer we stay awake. Put in a way that feels close to daily life, the human brain listens both to its inner clock and to the growing debt of wakefulness carried through the day. Only when those two forces meet in a way that is favourable enough does the human brain drift more easily into sleep and move fully through its cycles. That circadian rhythm is not only about feeling sleepy or waking up. It also reaches into hormones, body temperature, alertness, and the way organs throughout the body coordinate with one another across the hours of the day. The United States National Institute of General Medical Sciences explains that light and darkness are the strongest signals shaping circadian rhythm, although food, movement, stress, temperature, and the social environment can also influence it. This helps explain why a night spent up too late in front of a bright screen, or a stretch of life spent out of sync with the natural rhythm of day and night, does not just make us tired. It causes the human brain to lose part of the underlying rhythm it depends on to organise time from within. And when that underlying rhythm begins to wobble, many other functions stop running as smoothly as they once did. But no matter how important circadian rhythm may be, sleep itself is still not one uniform block. Descriptions from the United States National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke show that the human brain moves through different stages of sleep. The first stage of non-rapid eye movement sleep is the transition from wakefulness into sleep. The next stage is a lighter form of sleep before the brain moves into deep sleep. Deep sleep appears more often in the first half of the night. Then, about 90 minutes after falling asleep, the human brain usually enters rapid eye movement sleep, the stage in which people tend to dream the most. That cycle repeats across the night, with the balance among the stages gradually shifting over time. In other words, a good night of sleep is not a motionless sea, it is a rhythmic architecture in which each layer of sleep serves work that is a little different from the others. Because different layers of sleep do different kinds of work, science no longer sees sleep as a merely passive state. Materials from the United States National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke emphasize that memory consolidation most likely depends on both non-rapid eye movement sleep and rapid eye movement sleep. The United States National Institute of Mental Health also notes that sleep is not only restorative, but also creates changes in the brain that support learning and memory. Put very gently, daytime gives the human brain the raw material of life, while nighttime gives the human brain the time to turn that material into something it can carry for longer. One of the most beautiful ideas in sleep science is that new memories do not simply lie still during the night. Many neuroscience studies show that recently learned traces can be reactivated during rest and during sleep, almost as if the human brain is replaying a compressed version of what has just been lived. The United States National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke has shown that even short breaks after learning a new skill can be accompanied by the brain replaying motor memories. More recent reviews of memory reactivation during sleep also suggest that newly formed memories may be reactivated in the hippocampus as an important step in consolidation. So when you sleep after a day of learning something new, the human brain is not simply putting data away. The human brain is quietly practicing again, rearranging where things belong and connecting what is new to networks that were already there before. This is also where we begin to understand why there are things that feel tangled tonight, but seem a little clearer in the morning. A musical passage that still does not feel steady in your hands, a new name that remains hazy, an idea you have read but not yet fully absorbed, often does not improve much when you force yourself to keep going in a state of exhaustion. And yet after enough sleep it may become more coherent. That is not magic, it fits the logic of the human brain. By day the human brain takes things in. By night the human brain tests what is worth keeping, what should be linked to what, and what deserves to become more lasting knowledge rather than a short-lived echo. It is in that darkness that the human brain quietly revises yesterday in order to prepare for tomorrow. And then there are dreams, the part of sleep that makes it feel both familiar and mysterious. Science still does not have one final answer to the question of what dreams are for, but there are ways of understanding them that are worth taking seriously. The United States National Institute of Mental Health describes dreaming as an experiential event that takes place during sleep. Some review papers suggest that dream content may partly reflect memory processes being worked through in the brain at the same time. So we can say, carefully, that dreams may be one of the subjective traces of the human brain reorganizing the material of life, rather than merely a meaningless film. When old scenes, old people, present worries, and unrelated fragments suddenly blend together in a dream, that may be the human brain trying out new ways of linking pieces of life that we still could not see fitting together during the day. There is another nighttime task that is quieter still, and in recent years it has been receiving more attention in neuroscience. In 2024, the United States National Institutes of Health published findings showing that in living people, there are fluid channels surrounding blood vessels that help guide cerebrospinal fluid into brain tissue, matching what is often called the glymphatic system. That summary from the United States National Institutes of Health also noted that many earlier studies suggested this system may become more active during sleep. Even earlier animal studies showed that fluid flow through the brain increases clearly during sleep or sleep-like states, and that the removal of certain substances such as beta-amyloid happens more quickly during sleep. That means the image of the brain cleaning itself at night is no longer only a beautiful metaphor. It is a real scientific direction, even though much still remains to be clarified in human beings. That is why the idea of paying back sleep debt may sound folksy, but it is not without basis. The United States National Heart, Lung and Blood Institute explains that the total amount of missing sleep that builds up over time is called sleep debt. Short daytime naps may bring a temporary boost in alertness and performance, but they do not fully replace the benefits of nighttime sleep. This fits very well with the way the human brain works. A shortened night is not just the loss of a few quiet hours lying still. It is the loss of time for different sleep stages, the loss of opportunity for memory consolidation, for emotional regulation, for the rebalancing of attention, and perhaps also for other important biological clearing processes. The human brain does not forget those lost hours simply because we try harder the next day. When sleep is not enough, or when it lacks quality, the first changes often appear in functions that seem very ordinary. The United States National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke emphasizes that without sleep, the human brain has trouble forming or maintaining the neural pathways needed for learning and new memory. The United States National Institute on Aging also notes that poor quality sleep can lead to memory problems, more negative emotions, more stress in relationships, and a greater risk of falls or accidents. Recent scientific reviews are consistent on the point that sleep deprivation reduces sustained attention, weakens working memory, and may make decision-making more impulsive or riskier. In other words, when sleep is lacking, the human brain is not only tired, it begins writing reality in a narrower, harsher, and less accurate way. That is also why a lack of sleep can alter emotion so strongly. A person who sleeps badly does not just yawn more. They may become more irritable, more likely to feel threatened, less patient with ambiguity, and less able to support other people. The United States National Institute on Aging notes that poor sleep is associated with more negative emotion, and more stress in relationships. When we remember what we have already seen about emotion and the social brain, this becomes very logical. The human brain uses sleep to rebalance emotion. If that part of the work is lost, then the social signals of the next day are more likely to be read as sharper, heavier, or more exhausting. A sentence that is only slightly brief may sound colder than it is. A small difficulty may feel much larger. An afternoon may stretch beyond what we can comfortably bear. For older adults, sleep often changes in very characteristic ways. The United States National Institute on Aging explains that older adults generally still need about 7 to 9 hours of sleep each night, just like other adults. But they tend to go to bed earlier, wake up earlier, sleep more lightly and for shorter stretches, and wake more often during the night. What matters is that this does not mean the aging human brain somehow needs less sleep in any essential sense. The need for sleep does not disappear, but sleep architecture and the ability to maintain continuous sleep may change. At the same time, medications, chronic pain, physical illness, anxiety disorders, depression and sleep apnea all become more common and may intrude more into the night. So the experience of sleep no longer being what it used to be in later life is biologically real, not merely subjective. Even that reminds us that night is not a blank space where the mind disappears. The United States National Institute of Mental Health has noted that sleep unfolds under the influence of both homeostatic balance and circadian rhythm, and may not even occur in exactly the same way across every part of the brain. That sentence is beautiful if we listen to it slowly. It means that while we imagine ourselves to be asleep, the human brain is not simply falling into one uniform silence. Some circuits slow down, some switch tasks, some networks help generate dreams, some characteristic electrical rhythms accompany memory consolidation, and some parts of the human brain continue working in ways that no longer resemble daytime at all. Night, then, is not when the mind disappears. Night is when the mind begins a different kind of work, and perhaps that is why sleep becomes one of the gentlest proofs of the central truth of this whole journey. The human brain does not only respond to reality when we're awake. The human brain also quietly prepares reality for the following day while we sleep. It takes the experiences of the previous day, passes them through many layers of sleep, keeps some things, softens others, gives new memories a place to stand, lightens or deepens certain emotional lines, and sometimes clears the biological path for a brighter mind tomorrow. In the dark, the human brain quietly revises yesterday in order to prepare for tomorrow. And if it can do that every night, then across the years, across learning, across injury and recovery, the human brain cannot possibly remain unchanged. It must be shaped by what it lives through, and that is where the next door begins to open. And so from the night, from sleep quietly arranging memory and emotion, we arrive at a discovery that brings a great deal of hope. The human brain does not only work, the human brain also changes itself through that work. It is not cast once and then left unchanged until the end of life. It learns, adapts, compensates, reorganizes, and often quietly rewrites the very pathways that signals will travel through tomorrow. In the language of neuroscience, this is called neuroplasticity, meaning the ability of the nervous system to change its activity, structure, function, or connections in response to input from within or from the outside world. It is also one of the foundations of learning in a healthy brain, as well as at least part of the reason recovery can happen after injury. The first thing to remember is that a child's brain is not simply a smaller version of an adult brain. From the earliest years, the human brain differs from the mature brain not only in size, but in the way it is organized, in the speed at which it changes, in how flexible it is, and in the order in which different regions reach maturity. Reviews of neurodevelopment show that maturation does not happen all at once. Basic sensory and motor regions reach their peak earlier, while the frontal regions involved in behavioral control, planning, and executive function mature much later, extending through adolescence and into early adulthood. That means in the human brain, maturity does not switch on all at once. It is a construction project unfolding in many different rhythms, and within that construction project, neural development is not only a matter of adding more and more, it is also a matter of building pathways and then pruning them. In childhood and early life, the human brain creates a great many connections, more than it will keep for the long term. Then over the years, especially during adolescence and early adulthood, Some circuits are strengthened while others that are used less or fit less well may be reduced in a process often called synaptic pruning. Some reviews even note that in certain cortical regions, synapse density may decline substantially from late childhood into early adulthood. It sounds like a loss, but in truth it is often part of refinement. The human brain does not grow only by adding more. The human brain also grows by making its networks leaner, more efficient, and better suited to the world it is learning how to live in. That brings us to another beautiful truth. At its deepest level, learning is not just a matter of having more information in your head. Learning means changing the very connections of the human brain. Many sources on synaptic plasticity show that memory and learning are closely tied to activity-dependent changes at the synapse, the points of contact where nerve cells influence one another. When a network is used again and again in a meaningful way, the strength of those connections can increase or change, and over time, these small shifts help create a new ability, a new memory, or a new response. So what we call learning is really the trace of experience being written into the living material of the human brain. That is also why repetition has so much power. An action practiced many times, a pattern of thought returned to over and over, a skill trained slowly across weeks and months. All of these can make the right circuits smoother and more efficient. Principles of experience-dependent plasticity emphasize that using a function or a pathway can strengthen it, while using it less can gradually weaken it. Put more gently and more simply, the human brain listens to what you repeat. It does not only listen to what you wish for, it listens to what you actually practice. Just a few minutes each day, if repeated long enough, can quietly leave a deeper trace than one burst of determination that flares up and fades away very quickly. But repetition alone still does not tell the whole story. Attention and emotion strongly shape what gets preserved in the human brain. We have already gone through the way emotion marks what is important, and the way sleep helps strengthen the traces that have been marked. From the perspective of neuroplasticity, that makes perfect sense. Learning and development are powerful drivers of change in the nervous system, but not every experience leaves the same depth of mark. When something is closely attended to, tied to motivation, or paired with meaningful emotion, the human brain is usually more likely to strengthen it. That is why a study session you are fully engaged in is very different from skimming through something while exhausted. A skill connected to joy, purpose, or personal meaning usually takes root more deeply than a skill that is forced on you when the human brain cannot see any value in it. This becomes especially clear when human beings learn new skills. Research on motor learning, music, language, and many other areas shows that practice can lead to functional changes, and sometimes even structural changes, in the networks involved. The maps that represent movement, sensation, or coordination can be reorganized through experience. The human brain does not simply store a skill the way a drawer stores an object. It adjusts itself so that the skill becomes more possible, more efficient, and more precise. That is why every new skill does not only add something to your life, it also quietly revises part of the brain that learned how to do it. In youth, these changes often happen with a kind of obvious momentum that makes neuroplasticity easy to imagine. But what gives even greater hope is that the human brain does not stop changing after the early years. Many reviews on cognitive aging emphasize that while decline in some areas is real and common, the path of the brain and of cognitive function in later life still varies greatly, still retains plasticity, and cannot be described simply as one long downward slope. Models such as scaffolding theory suggest that the older brain may recruit extra neural resources or redistribute them to compensate for structural decline or lower efficiency elsewhere. Put more simply, when some paths are no longer as fast or as direct as they once were, the human brain sometimes knows how to find a smarter detour. That means aging is not only decline, aging is also reprioritizing, compensating, and accumulating in a different way. Some studies of the aging brain suggest that in many situations, older adults may show patterns of activity that are more distributed or more broadly integrated than those of younger adults, sometimes interpreted as a form of compensation. At the same time, many years of living bring stores of knowledge, strategies, and patterns of meaning that a younger brain may not yet have. So there are things that may slow down, but there are also things that may grow deeper, quieter, and less easily pulled around by short-term stimulation. The human brain does not age according to one single formula. It changes its strategy as it changes with age. Another place where neuroplasticity appears with special weight is after injury. For many decades, people underestimated how much the adult brain could change after stroke or trauma. But major reviews of recovery after brain injury show that the human brain can go through clinically meaningful functional changes after damage, and behavioural experience, especially goal-directed rehabilitation practice, is one of the strongest factors shaping that process. What matters is that this hope must remain accurate. The human brain can adapt to a certain extent, but not without limits, and that reorganization may be helpful, or sometimes less than optimal, depending on the kind of injury, the timing, the intensity, and the quality of rehabilitation. Even so, the simple fact that the human brain can still relearn and reorganize after disruption is one of the most moving truths in all of neuroscience. From there, we begin to see that the smallest daily habits are not small at all for the human brain. A life that includes regular movement, learning, communication, attention directed toward what matters, better sleep, and repeated healthy practices can support positive forms of adaptation. On the other hand, lack of stimulation, prolonged stress, too little movement, or the repeated use of maladaptive response patterns can leave marks in the opposite direction. Some models of adaptive aging even suggest that intellectual activity, movement, and engagement with life may support compensatory mechanisms in the aging brain. Put very gently, the human brain is always listening to your daily life and then answering through its own structure. This is where a hope that is very real and not vague at all begins to appear. The human brain is a system that always carries some capacity for change. That capacity is not unlimited. It does not erase every biological limit, it does not guarantee that every injury can be fully reversed, and it does not make age lose its power. But modern science shows quite clearly that the human brain is not a block of fixed stone. From development, learning, and maturity to aging and recovery after injury, neuroplasticity runs all the way through the story. And that allows us to see life not only as something that happens to the brain, but as something that is constantly helping shape the brain. And if we listen to that very slowly, we may feel something gentle inside it. You're not only living with the brain you were first given. Day by day, you're also taking part in creating the brain you will carry with you later on. Every lesson learned deeply, every skill practiced long enough, every pattern of attention repeated again and again, every decent night of sleep, every way you respond to sorrow or recover after stumbling, all of it can leave some kind of mark. The human brain does not only record life. The human brain is touched by life, revised by it, and gradually shaped by it. And precisely because it can change in that way, we are forced to look toward the other side of the story as well. What happens when that change moves through harsher limits? When the human brain encounters injury, decline, disease, and has to reveal both its resilience and its fragility. And then, from the very hope that neuroplasticity gives us, we are also forced to look at the other half of the story. The human brain can learn, adapt, and reorganize, but precisely because it is a living organ with extremely high metabolic demands, it is more fragile than we usually imagine. Sources from the United States National Institute on Aging and the United States National Library of Medicine both emphasize that neurons need a continuous supply of oxygen and glucose delivered by the blood, and that the brain uses up about 1/5 of the body's energy. That means the human brain does not have a wide margin of safety when interruption occurs. If blood flow, oxygen, or biological balance is disrupted enough, the work of building memory, language, emotion, attention, and the sense of self can begin to shake with it. The organ that quietly creates the inner world we live inside turns out to depend deeply on things as physical as blood flow, blood vessels, and energy. Perhaps nothing shows that fragility more clearly than stroke. The United States National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke describes stroke as a condition in which blood flow to the brain is blocked, or a blood vessel in or on the surface of the brain bursts. When blood is stopped or reduced, some brain cells die because they no longer receive enough oxygen and nutrients. Symptoms can appear suddenly, and depending on the area of the brain affected, a person may struggle with speech, movement, memory, attention, awareness, or judgment. What is haunting, and also very real, is that just one injured region can alter an entire person's private version of the world. A person is still themselves, and yet suddenly cannot call up words, cannot see one side of space, can no longer smoothly control an arm, or can no longer read the face of a loved one the way they once could. Stroke reminds us that the reality the human brain constructs for us always rests on a biological foundation so specific that the failure of a single blood vessel can change the entire window through which life is seen. Brain injury tells a similar story, only by a different path. According to the United States National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke, some forms of traumatic brain injury can cause temporary or short-term problems in brain function, including difficulties with thinking, understanding, movement, communication, and behaviour. The same institute also notes that repeated blows to the head can be associated with memory problems, loss of coordination, tremor, and in the long run may be linked to dementia. In some people, years after the injury, changes in behaviour and mood can still appear. That means brain injury is not only a physical blow, it can alter the way the human brain binds together the pieces of the self. A person after an injury may still recognise family, may still have the same familiar voice, yet may find it harder to focus, become more impulsive, tire more easily, or feel emotion moving through unfamiliar paths. In that moment, what has been touched is not only brain tissue, but the very way a human being is present in their own world. Neurodegenerative diseases carry that story even further, because here the change often does not come as one single event, but as a long and quiet process. The United States National Institute on Aging explains that in Alzheimer's disease, neurons gradually stop functioning normally, lose their connections to one another, and then die, leading to widespread loss of brain function. At first, the damage usually affects regions involved in memory, such as the hippocampus and entorhinal cortex, and later spreads to areas responsible for language, reasoning, and social behaviour. The United States National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke also shows that other forms of dementia have their own patterns. Dementia with Lewy bodies can alter thinking, movement, sleep, behaviour, and mood, while frontotemporal dementia can strongly change personality, behaviour, and language. These diseases remind us of something that is both scientific and almost philosophical: memory, reason, social grace, temperament, and even the feeling of this is me all have roots in the biology of the human brain, and when that biology changes, the self can be pulled off course with it. That is exactly why disorders of the brain and mind should not be viewed as a moral failure. The United States National Institute of Mental Health defines mental illness as mental, behavioural, or emotional disorders that can cause impairment ranging from mild to severe, and that same institute reports that more than 1 in 5 adults in the United States lived with a mental illness in the year 2022. At the same time, the institute also clearly presents evidence-based treatments through psychotherapy, medication, and in some cases brain stimulation therapy. From this point of view, when a person falls into depression, severe anxiety, obsessive-compulsive disorder, or other psychiatric conditions, science does not treat them as someone lacking willpower or character. Science treats these conditions as states that can be diagnosed, monitored, and treated within a healthcare system. Put very gently, perhaps one of the most humane advances in brain science is that it helps us stop assigning moral judgment to what truly belongs to suffering, disorder, and the need for care. Mental health and brain health, then, overlap far more deeply than everyday language often suggests. The United States National Institute of Mental Health notes that people with chronic illness are at greater risk for depression, and part of the reason may be changes in the brain caused by diseases such as Parkinson's disease or stroke. The Institute also emphasises that when depression appears alongside chronic illness, both sides of the illness often become worse. That means the line between a disease of the brain and a disease of the mind is not nearly as clear as we once hoped. A change in cerebral blood vessels, in movement networks, in the limbic system, or in metabolic activity may come with changes in mood, motivation, concentration, and the very feeling of being alive. And in the other direction, depression may make it harder for a person to care for themselves, continue treatment, and protect physical health. Here, the human brain does not appear as a machine divided into tidy compartments. It appears as a system in which biology and subjective experience are tightly wound together. Even so, the story of the human brain's fragility does not end in loss. Modern medicine today does not only describe these disorders, it is also learning how to interact with the brain in increasingly refined ways. The United States National Institute of Mental Health explains that psychotherapy and medication are the most common forms of mental health treatment, and that medication can play an important role in treating many mental disorders, often alongside talk therapy or other approaches. The important point here is not to treat any one method as a miracle. The important point is to see that science has moved from merely observing a suffering brain to actively trying to intervene in the biological and behavioural pathways that are causing that suffering. When a therapist helps someone recognise and reshape painful patterns of thought, when a physician adjusts medication to reduce symptoms, or when a rehabilitation team helps a stroke survivor relearn movement or language, all of these are different ways of entering into a dialogue with a brain that has been injured or disrupted. In some more severe conditions, medicine now even interacts with the brain through electricity or magnetic fields. The United States National Institute of Mental Health explains that electroconvulsive therapy is a non-invasive procedure that uses an electric current to produce seizure activity in the brain and has the longest history of use in treating depression. Repetitive transcranial magnetic stimulation is a non-invasive method that uses electromagnets to generate low-intensity magnetic pulses that stimulate neurons and neural circuits, and it has now been cleared by the United States Food and Drug Administration for treatment-resistant depression, obsessive-compulsive disorder, and some other conditions. Vagus nerve stimulation is a surgical procedure that implants a device under the skin to send electrical pulses through the vagus nerve. It was first developed for epilepsy and later approved under certain conditions for depression. Only a few decades ago, the idea of intentionally acting on brain circuits to treat illness sounded like science fiction. Now it is a real part of modern medicine. Deep brain stimulation carries that feeling even further. The United States National Institute of Mental Health currently places deep brain stimulation in the category of approaches that remain experimental for psychiatric disorders, while the United States National Institute of Neurological Disorders and Stroke describes it as treatment for symptoms of certain movement disorders such as Parkinson's disease, essential tremor, and dystonia. That means that for some neurological diseases, medicine can already place electrodes into specific locations in the brain to adjust the activity of neural circuits, while for some psychiatric illnesses, similar directions are still being studied with caution. This does not make the human brain any less mysterious in a complete sense, but it shows that science no longer stands entirely outside the door. Science is learning how to touch the very circuits that in some people give rise to tremor, rigidity, obsessive urges, or severe depression. And the more medicine learns how to touch the brain, the more it must move alongside ethics, because to act on the human brain is also to act on the very foundation of subjective experience. Perhaps that is why every major neurological case carries an unspoken philosophical question. If a person after stroke still has intact memory but loses language, are they still fully themselves? If a person with frontotemporal dementia gradually loses the social restraint that once helped define their personality, which part of the self is changing and which part remains? If Alzheimer's disease slowly takes away memory for recent years, but still leaves a few habits, a familiar melody, or a squeeze of the hand in response to a loved one's voice, where exactly are we meant to look for that person? Science does not always answer those questions with one neat sentence. But the diseases of the brain force us to see that the self does not float outside living matter. It is supported by memory, attention, language, emotional regulation, social behaviour, and specific neural networks. When those networks change, the question of who am I is no longer purely philosophical. It becomes an emotional, biological question. But even here, the deepest thing may not be fear. The deepest thing may be value. It is precisely because the human brain is this fragile that conscious life becomes more precious. A fluent sentence, a clear morning, the ability to remember the name of someone you love, the ability to walk without thinking, the ability to understand a glance and answer it with the right tone, all of these things that seem ordinary stand on an incredibly delicate and highly refined biological foundation. Once we know that neurons need a constant supply of blood and oxygen, that a vessel breaking or becoming blocked can alter an entire life, that degenerative disease can strip away layer after layer of memory and behaviour, we do not simply see the human brain as weaker, we see it as more miraculous. Consciousness does not necessarily become less sacred when it is placed on a biological foundation. Very often, it becomes more sacred because we understand how difficult it is to preserve. And from that very fragility, one final doorway opens. Because if the human brain can be changed by lack of blood flow, by injury, by degenerative disease, by emotional disorder, and even by medical interventions directed at neural circuits, then what we call I cannot be a fixed object sitting somewhere inside the head. It must be a process continuously supported, updated, and retold by the human brain. Everything we have travelled through so far seems to converge on that point. The human brain does not only create memory, emotion, perception, and relationship. The human brain also creates the feeling that there is someone who is remembering, feeling, seeing, and living through all of those things. And that is where this journey is about to enter its deepest layer. After moving through the structure of the human brain, through the way it protects survival, builds perception, retells memory, colours the world with emotion, opens itself in relationship, works through the night, and changes across a lifetime while still remaining fragile, we're almost standing at the edge of the deepest question of all. Who is all of this happening to? Who is the one who is seeing, remembering, grieving, hoping, and feeling like the same self from one year to the next? The strange thing is that when we ask the question that way, the human brain does not lead us to one single glowing point hidden somewhere inside the head, like a secret room where the self sits waiting to be found. What neuroscience has suggested so far is far more subtle than that. The human brain seems not only to create awareness of the world, it also creates the feeling that there is someone who is aware of that world. And that feeling, because it is so familiar, is often treated as the most obvious thing of all, when it may in fact be the most refined achievement of the entire brain. Some studies of self-reflection suggest that the regions most often mentioned are the medial prefrontal cortex and the posterior cingulate cortex, areas along the brain's midline that often become active when people think about themselves, remember personal experiences, or evaluate who they are. But what matters here is that scientists do not describe these regions as the place where the self is stored. They describe them as important nodes within networks involved in processing self-related information. That phrasing alone changes a great deal. It suggests that the self in the human brain may not be an object at all. It may be more like an activity, a style of organisation, something that happens when many networks work together to keep your experience centred around the sense of me. In that sense, the human brain does not store the self inside a box. The human brain continuously builds the self by allowing many parts of life to converge into one stream of experience. This also fits with the way science now speaks about consciousness. There is still no final absolute agreement on how consciousness arises, but one influential line of theory suggests that a piece of information becomes conscious only when it is no longer trapped inside a single local processing module, but is amplified and broadcast more widely so that many other systems in the brain can access it as well. The global neuronal workspace hypothesis describes consciousness in that direction. Information becomes conscious when it reaches the point of being widely broadcast to different processors. Even though this is still a theory being tested and debated alongside others, it offers a very memorable image. Consciousness may not be a simple switch that turns on and off. It may be more like a state of integration, where what is happening becomes shared enough, common enough, and accessible enough inside the human brain that you are not only processing it, but also know that you are experiencing it. If we listen to that very slowly, we can feel how beautiful it is. Because throughout this journey, we have met parts of the human brain doing very different things. Some parts care for the body, some care for memory, some care for attention, some care for emotion, some care for relationship, some care for prediction. And perhaps what we call consciousness is what happens when those streams are no longer scattered. They are bound together tightly enough to create an experience with a centre. That is why the human brain does not merely create a colour red, a sound, a pain, or an old memory. The human brain also creates the feeling that I am the one seeing that red, hearing that sound, feeling that pain, and remembering that moment from my life. The moment when there is a content becomes, there is someone having that content may be one of the deepest things the human brain is doing. But if the self is not a single object, then what is it woven from? One very basic part of the answer lies in the body. Many studies of bodily consciousness show that the sense of where you are in space and from where you are viewing the world is not trivial at all. These components, sometimes described as bodily self-consciousness, are linked to networks that prominently involve the temporoparietal junction and the insula, especially in the right hemisphere in many studies. When those components are disturbed, as in certain bodily illusions or neurological injuries, the sense of self-location and first-person perspective can change quite dramatically. That suggests that one deep layer of the self does not begin in philosophy. It begins with a very basic sentence: I am here, and I am seeing the world from this point. The human brain has to keep that sentence stable enough for the higher layers of the self to have something to rest on. And beneath even that sense of position is the feeling of the living body from within. Research on interoception shows that the anterior insula plays a very important role in attending to signals coming from the body, such as breathing, heartbeat, and internal state. One study combining brain imaging with patients who had focal lesions showed that the anterior insula not only became active when people directed attention to their breathing, but that damage in this region also impaired the ability to distinguish interoceptive signals. That is deeply worth reflecting on because it suggests that the feeling of I is not tied only to thought or memory. It is also tied to the fact that the human brain is continuously reading the living body of its own self. Part of the self may not be the story we tell, but the quiet sense that there is still a body breathing, tightening, softening, and continuing to exist from one second to the next. From the body, the human brain rises into memory. We have already seen that autobiographical memory does not merely store life stories, but also helps preserve the feeling of continuity across time. Reviews on autobiographical memory and the self show that the sense of a subjective self is a very important condition for episodic memory, and that autobiographical memory in return helps maintain the ongoing continuity of the self. Other work also emphasizes the two-way relationship between autobiographical memory and personal identity. The way we see ourselves in the present shapes what we remember about the past, and what we remember about the past shapes the person we believe ourselves to be. Put in a very human way, if the body gives the human brain the sense that I am here, then memory gives the human brain the sense that I have lived through these things and I am still that person. That is how life avoids falling apart into disconnected fragments. But the self in the human brain is not made of memory alone. It is also made of language. Very often we know who we are by telling it. We speak to other people about ourselves, but we also speak to ourselves about ourselves. A role, a sentence like I am this kind of person, a self-defining memory, a way of naming a wound or a joy, all of these help the human brain do something very important: compress life into a story coherent enough to carry forward. Some studies suggest that memories tightly linked to the important goals of a life period can become self-defining memories and then become part of the larger story of a life. This does not mean a person is nothing but a story, but it does suggest that the self in the human brain is stabilized in part through the ability to use language to connect events into meaning. When meaning is preserved, the self is preserved too. That is also why we are not entirely our thoughts. Thoughts are part of experience, but they are not the whole foundation of the self. An anxious thought appearing is not enough to define an entire person. A painful memory returning does not automatically become a person's essence. The human brain produces a great deal of content: images, inner speech, predictions, warnings, associations, impulses. If we mistake all of that for the whole of who we are, then we would have to live inside a self that is far too fragile, always dragged away by whichever signal happens to flare up in the moment. But when we step back and look through what science suggests, we begin to see that the self may be much wider than that. It is the result of integration among the body, memory, relationships, emotion, attention, and many other layers of processing, not simply the stream of thought that happens to be speaking the loudest in one given moment. That does not separate us from the human brain. It shows us that the human brain is richer than the temporary contents it produces, and yet we're also not completely separate from the brain that produced those thoughts. This is the point that has to be spoken very slowly, so we do not fall into either extreme. On one hand, a human being cannot be reduced to a single electrical impulse or a single brain region. On the other hand, everything we have already seen about stroke, injury, dementia, and emotional disorder shows that the self does not float outside living matter either. When neural networks change, the sense of self can change with them. When memory is damaged, the story of a life begins to open at the seams. When interoception, self-location, or emotional regulation becomes disrupted, the way we inhabit the world changes as well. So saying that a person is not only the brain does not mean that a person can be fully separated from the brain. It may be more accurate to say that the self is a form of living supported by the human brain, not a purely biological object, but not a ghost outside biology either. Another discovery makes the story even deeper. What we call each person's private reality is largely built from the way the brain connects past, present, and future. Studies of the default mode network show that this is not merely an idle network, but one that plays a major role in spontaneous thought, remembering the past, imagining the future, thinking about the self, and engaging with the social world. Some reviews even describe this network as a place where information from memory, language, and the longer layers of meaning and experience becomes integrated. If that is true, then our private reality has never been a bare present moment alone. It is a present moment that the human brain has already placed into the continuing stream of what has happened before and what may happen next. A room is not only the room in front of your eyes. It is a room being compared to older rooms, to predictions about the next few minutes, to the emotions you are carrying, and to the story of yourself that is active at that moment. That is why the continuity of the self may be a story told smoothly enough to hold together. This does not mean the self is fake, quite the opposite. It means the self is a very living achievement. The human brain has to keep doing the work of preventing change from making us fall apart, while also preventing stability from making us freeze. Every day, the body changes a little, memory shifts its colour a little, emotions rise and fall, relationships grow and fade, and still the human brain manages to tell a story seamless enough that tomorrow morning you wake up knowing you are still you. Some work on memory, and the self refers to this as phenomenal continuity, or the identity function of autobiographical memory. Perhaps the self feels enduring not because it never changes, but because the human brain is very good at turning change into continuity. And then, at the deepest point, this whole journey seems to gather into one strange and peaceful realization. The most living thing about a human being may not lie in permanence. It may lie in the ability to keep becoming. The human brain gives us a sense of I that is stable enough to live, love, remember, and take responsibility. But at the same time, the human brain also allows that I to be updated by experience, by learning, by loss, by recovery, and by things understood only later. If the self is a process supported by memory, body, relationships, attention, and integrated consciousness, then becoming is not something happening at the edge of a human life. Becoming is the very way the self exists. In the end, the human brain does not only create a person. The human brain creates the possibility for that person to keep being formed. Perhaps that is why the final thing we should carry out of this journey is not a closed answer, but a softer way of seeing ourselves. You're not only a memory, not only an emotion, not only a habit, not only a thought that just passed through, and you are not only an anonymous mass of brain tissue either. You're a form of living that the human brain is quietly holding together, continuously updating through what you live through, and retelling gently enough that you can wake each day with the feeling that you still recognize yourself. If there is one highest truth about the human brain, perhaps it is this. The human brain does not only help us have experiences, the human brain helps us have a someone who can experience them. And at the deepest level, the most beautiful thing about that someone is not that they stand still, but that they can keep becoming across time. After everything we have just walked through together, the deepest truth about the human brain may also be the gentlest one. The human brain is not simply an organ that helps you see, hear, remember, think, or react. The human brain is the place that quietly weaves together what you call a life. From tiny electrical signals, from memories called back and rewritten, from emotions that change the colour of an afternoon, from sleep that silently rearranges the day that came before, from the relationships that helped raise you, from loss, recovery, learning, and change across the years, the human brain never stops creating a world with shape, with meaning, with depth, and with you inside it. From beginning to end, we have travelled through the structure of the human brain, through the way it prioritises survival, through the way it does not see the world like a passive camera, but instead selects, fills in, and reconstructs reality on its own. We have moved through memory to understand that the past does not lie still like an object stored away in a warehouse, but is retold by the human brain every time we remember. We have moved through emotion to see that emotion does not stand against reason, but helps the human brain mark what matters. We have moved through sleep to realize that night is not an empty gap, but the most silent shift of the brain's ongoing work. We have moved through change to understand that the human brain can learn, adapt, compensate, and reorganize throughout an entire lifetime. And then we also look directly at its very real fragility, to understand just how precious all the things that seem ordinary in a single human day truly are. But in the end, all of those paths return to the same point. The human brain does not only help you live in this world, the human brain also gives you a world to live inside. It creates your sense of time, of memory, of hope, of fear, of closeness, of loss, of dreams, and deeper still, it creates the feeling that there is someone experiencing all of those things. Perhaps that is why the 101st truth does not live inside any one number or any single detail, but inside this realization, the thing you call me is not a fixed object sitting somewhere inside your head, but a living process the human brain is continuously weaving from the body, sensation, memory, emotion, sleep, relationship, and time. And if tonight's journey leaves behind anything of value, perhaps it is the feeling of understanding yourself a little more clearly, understanding why some memories hold on longer than others, understanding why emotion can change the way you think, understanding why sleep is not merely rest, but the foundation that allows the human brain to keep doing its work, understanding why age is not only about loss, but also about transformation, and understanding that the human self has never been a fixed block, but something always alive, always moving, always being written forward day by day. If tonight you close your eyes feeling gentler, slower, and a little clearer about who you are, then perhaps your human brain has quietly done what it has always done so well. It has connected scattered pieces into a world that means something. Thank you for taking this entire journey with Sleep by Knowledge. I wish you a truly peaceful night, a deeply restful sleep, and I will see you again in the next journey.